In 2006, Hasbro took over the license of Marvel Legends from ToyBiz. It would be something of a bumpy start for Hasbro because the initial waves they released were met with a fairly mixed reaction, and it was clear that Hasbro were a few years away from perfecting their formula that we know today. But quite early on in the line, aside from their 6-inch scale line, they also decided to pick up the mantle of the 12-inch scale that ToyBiz had begun experimenting with. Hasbro would produce quite a lot of figures in this 12-inch scale, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Doctor Doom. Now, to start off with, the packaging, it leaves a lot to be desired really. It is essentially one giant plastic window display where we can just basically see the figure, and there's a little bit of branding at the bottom there. In its defense, I do like the image that they've gone with of Doctor Doom in the right hand corner. I think this is a really nice, bright, colourful, true to source image, which is great. And the packaging is fairly slimline, which makes it fairly easy to stack these together without taking up too much space. But in my opinion, it doesn't hold a candle to the Marvel Legends packaging that we saw under ToyBiz, which was much more of a big, bulky presentation case. And the figure, once he's out of the packaging, is something of a mixed bag really, and I think it's an uneasy alliance between the kinds of materials they've used for the costume. On the one hand, he's got this quite nice, luxurious, thick cloak, which looks pretty cool, and then you've got the plastic and rubber green tunic, which just looks a bit incongruous because obviously it's a different shade, it's a much darker green, and I think that contrast is a little bit jarring on the eyes. Now, one of the things I really do like about this figure though is the head sculpt, and we can see here that face mask is very nicely done. There's a lot of details, a lot of different things going on, and we can see individual rivets, and we can also see that the sculpt goes all the way to the back of the head when we pull the cloak down, and we can see a lot more detail on the sides of the face there, and see lots of detail going all the way to the back of the head, which is great. In particular, I wanted to highlight the sense of depth that they've managed to create because we can see there's a face underneath the mask. Now, you can't remove the mask, but if we angle it at certain positions, we can see that the eyes are quite set back, and we can see some of the scarred tissue of the face underneath. And I think this is really, really well painted and well rendered, and I think they've done a really excellent job of this. I do also really like the cloak. I think the cloak itself, the material used is very nice. It's quite thick and luxurious, and it's quite nice that you can pinch it over his shoulders as well if you want to. The only problem is that because of those plastic pins in place, you can't really do too much with it. You can't remove the cloak if you wanted to, for example, and it kind of holds it all in place. But as a result, it kind of means that you can't really do too much with the cloak. You are limited to the amount of dynamic poses you can put it in. And I'm also not a fan of them using a hard plastic for the upper torso here in the tunic. I think if they'd either use material or a rubber, this might have been more effective because, again, that contrast isn't great. But overall, I really do like the sculpt and the effort that's gone into this. If we look here at the shins, the kneecaps, the boots, there is a little bit of detail. There's nice rivets and grooves in here, which makes it look a bit more interesting. Likewise on his gauntlets, on his hand, there's little extra details there in the knuckles, which I just think is really quite effective. And also, the big circular discs on his elbows are a nice touch as well. Another little detail that I really quite like is the fact that they have gone to the effort of giving him his jetpack on the back of his back there. So this is a nice little touch. They didn't have to do this, and I think this is kind of fun. And as for articulation, well, he fares okay. It could be improved, but it's not bad. So he's got a swivel at the neck rather than a ball joint, which is okay. I would rather have had the ball joint there so he could nod his head up and down, but he can swivel it right the way around if you want him to. He does have ball jointed shoulders, thankfully, which is great. And one thing I would note with these figures is that they are kind of stiff and they kind of click into place, but at least you know that you're not going to break it, which is great. So his arms can obviously kick up and out to the side. He's got a single jointed elbow, meaning he can bend his arm to 90 degrees, and he's got a pin swivel at the wrist there as well. Again, this takes a little bit of doing, but his wrist can rotate 360 degrees, and his hand can arc inwards and outwards as well, which is great. Again, he sadly doesn't have any ab articulation, but he does have a swivel at the waist, so he can spin from side to side. And I should point out that in the hand, there's a little bit extra articulation because there is also a hinge at the knuckles as well, meaning he can sort of grasp or have an open hand. He does have a ball joint at the upper thigh, which is great, so his legs can kick out to the sides, and thanks to the rubber skirt, there's no hindrance there to the articulation, which is great, so he can easily flex in and out. And of course, kick his legs forwards a good distance, perhaps not as far as I might like, but there is still plenty of give there, which is good if you're willing to work with that rubber, and he can kick back. Again, this probably would have been more effective if they'd used cloth skirt rather than rubber, but nevertheless, it's still not a massive hindrance, which is good. He does, of course, have a single joint at the knee, so he can bend his leg about 90 degrees, and he's also got a hinge at the ankle as well, which has a little bit of range of motion, but not a huge amount, to be honest. And it really would have been nice to have had some ankle rockers here or something. Now, in terms of extras, he doesn't really come with an awful lot. There's no spell effects or spell books or anything like that, but he does have this gun in his holster. And this Luger-inspired weapon is pretty nicely done. It's a little bit too thin for my liking. It seems a little bit too slim there, so it looks a little bit cartoonish. It would have been nice if it was a bit bulky, but they have given it a nice grip. There's some decent detailing on it, and it's nice that there are two tones to this weapon. Thankfully though, he has no problems holding it whatsoever. It looks pretty good once it's in his hand, and he grips it nicely, even with that articulation that he has in the fingers, which is pretty cool. And the trigger finger nicely goes through and rests on the trigger there, so this looks pretty decent. And as you can see, here he is holding it, and it looks pretty cool when you do this. And overall, I have mixed feelings about this figure. I think the overall look and design of the figure is very nice. I think the sculpting is very well done. I think the paint apps where they are nicely rendered too. I think maybe they could have used a few more paint apps running through, say, the torso, for example, just to highlight some of the creases and grooves in the tunic. That would have been kind of cool. Just make it look a little bit more lived in. I'm not entirely sure that the cloth works with the plastic elements. It is a nice touch, but the cape just seems a little bit too restrictive, and it feels like you can't really get the most out of it, really, even though I do really like the cloth element. And as for the articulation, well, I think there's enough here to give you a decent range of posing possibilities, but overall it does feel a little bit restrictive. It does feel like you're not really being able to capitalise on the articulation that is there, and it just needed a little bit more to make it a bit more dynamic. But aside from that, I do think that this is one of Hasbro's more successful 12-inch scale figures. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.